Thank you. Take this off now. I brought in all sorts of headgear for the display up here. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is really, really special for me. This book, Beyond the Outpost, just published last November, came out on Audible in December, so it's new, um, and I'm just really honored to have you both online as well, hear my story. And it's not just my story, but it's a story of people that I served with who are no longer with us. And I'm hoping that this book will help spread some of the messages of their bravery. Um, People ask me what was it like to be Jewish and be in the army. And honestly, most of the time, it really just felt very natural, and that surprised me, because I wasn't expecting that. I think when you raise your hand and you join the military and you're Jewish, you're joining. I mean, wouldn't really. I didn't know this at the time, but I was joining into a sort of a tapestry of different Americans from lots of different faiths and backgrounds and corners of the country. And I found that for the most part, sharing my heritage, that I was Jewish, it was never meant with, never met with any type of hate. Instead, it was met with more curiosity, than any kind of conflict. I remember meeting, when I first became a lieutenant, I met another officer in my training unit at Fort Knox when I was training to become a tank platoon leader, and he was from Oklahoma, and he told me, and he was very proud that he was a Methodist from Oklahoma. And I said, "All right, he's sharing. I'm going to share too." And I told him, I'm Jewish from New Jersey. And he looked at me more with genuine awe than anything else. He'd actually told me he never met another Jewish person before. And, he told me that in his faith and in his upbringing, he was told that we're chosen, God's chosen people. And he was really proud, he said, to serve alongside me. So that was kind of a unique introduction to the Army for me. Um, I think truly in the military, it wasn't our differences that divided us. It was, the differences almost gave us a deeper reason to respect the person that we wanted to fight alongside on our left and our right. A lot of the books about Afghanistan in the market today are written with the benefit or maybe the blur of hindsight. But Beyond the Outpost is not written in that way. Um, it's truly a journal that I kept for 25 months while I was moving from forward operating base to forward operating base. So I tried to document everything that happened to me in real time. However tired I was, I forced myself to log an entry. So everything that we saw, everything that we were fearing, everything, missions we were losing or winning, certainly men and women that we served alongside in the sacrifices and sometimes their ultimate sacrifice, I wrote about. So today I want to talk to you about some of the more poignant stories from Beyond the Outpost, um, and a little bit about the burden of being a young officer and the responsibility of that, the humility that I think you need to carry with you to do that job, and kind of what it means to lead from the front when I never thought I was ever going to be in Afghanistan leading from the front. So it's a little bit of a mix between some more stories, and I'll read some excerpts too. Um, and hopefully we'll give you a better idea into the lives of some of the people that served in Afghanistan and the moments that stayed with me long after I came home. And this one in particular. The day was May 5th, 2006, and I was at Jalalabad Airfield in eastern Afghanistan. And I was the intelligence officer for a new Army reconnaissance unit, 371 Cavalry. I was part of the 10th Mountain Division on my second tour, and it was the third month. And it was Operation Mountain Lion was we dubbed the mission as Operation Mountain Lion, and it was D-Day plus 25, long time to be humping the mountains, and we were wrapping things up on May 5th. Our cavalry scouts were deep on top of mountaintop observation posts, And that night on May 5th, we were planning to get everyone out. We had a very successful 3 to 4 week mission uh, with actually no American fatalities, a lot of enemy cells destroyed. So we were happy with the results. In fact, if you know anything about the Marcus Luttrell story, you ever heard of the movie Lone Survivor or read the book Lone Survivor, then you know about Operation Red Wings. That was the bloodiest day of the war up until that time, with 18 special operators killed in one mission. And so this was 9 months after Operation Red Wings, and we were in the same mountains. Their ghosts were everywhere, and we were there to help find and destroy those Al Qaeda and Taliban elements that were responsible for the deaths of those 18 special operators, Navy SEALs, and Army Night Stalkers. So it was my job to shadow my boss on the right-hand side of the screen, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Fenty. I had followed him everywhere. We formed the unit together from scratch back at Fort Drum. We shared a Humvee across the mountaintops of the last 3 months in country. We shared the skies together, flying, doing reconnaissance for operations. And as the intelligence officer, it was me that drove him and drove our unit to go fight in this particular valley system. So in a lot of ways, Colonel Fenty and I, we shared the weight of this mission. So at that night, as I was in the Tactical Operations Center, I remember hearing the Chinook right outside, the Chinook helicopter right outside the TOC, and it was spinning its rotors. And Colonel Fenty was getting ready to climb on board to command and control the extraction of our scouts. We had about 75 scouts on top of those mountains. And then a moment happened, and that moment has never left me. He came up to me and he said something that I won't forget. He said, "Ross, I don't need you out with me on this one. Stay back and monitor the nets." And I said, "Yes, sir." That was the last time I ever saw him. What happened next unfolded in the operations center as I watched it on the big screens. We were trying to do something called a pinnacle landing. You can see the photograph in the lower left, where it was done at night. In fact, that photograph was taken very near the same location that I'm referring to. CH-47 could only land the two rear wheels. So the front of the aircraft was hanging off of this cliff. And it's a feat of physics and nerves to only touch down the two rear wheels and to do it at night. So I was monitoring this from the TOC. I was listening for enemy signals. I saw one attempt for the bird to touch down. Then I saw another attempt. Then finally a third attempt. And then I saw some scouts run up the ramp. And then the radio chatter, it started to go from tactical to static and then hysterical. And I ran into the watch floor and I saw my command sergeant major white knuckling the handset, and he was losing all composure, which was very rare for him. And he was yelling to the ground commander, "Are there any survivors?" he yelled. And he used the commander's name. Again, breaking radio protocol. He had lost all composure. And the voice that came back was pretty hollow. Said, "No way, Sergeant Major. There's no way anyone could have survived that." So somehow the rear rotor blade hit a tree stump that was sticking out, which our scouts were trying feverishly to cut down before the bird arrived with a pocket knife. But this rotor hit the tree stump and the bird went tumbling down the mountain. And there were 10 men on that helicopter, including Lieutenant Colonel Joe Fenty. So I heard this voice come back over the net and say, "There's no way anyone could have survived." And at that moment, there were about 40 of us in the ops room, and everyone just kind of fell silent, looked at the floor. And I didn't think at this moment, I sort of just ran. I ran for the exit. I needed some air. I needed it for it not to be true. I remember standing in the doorway of the exit was our brigade chaplain, who he and Joe Fenty had actually helped organize a Jewish chaplain to come to that base a few weeks earlier for Passover. He knew me, and he knew I was close with Colonel Fenty, and he was standing there kind of ready to give me a hug, but I wasn't ready to accept it. and I pushed past him and I ran out to a dark corner of the compound and I kind of dropped to my knees, but I wasn't praying. I was cursing, weeping for a man that had just saved my life by telling me to stay behind, and weeping for his wife and daughter. Just 4 weeks earlier, his wife gave birth to a young girl, Lauren Fenty, who he was supposed to be home with for R&R to see the birth, but of course, Operation Mountain Lion was happening, and he would not be anywhere else but with us. So I think moments like this is kind of why this book exists. Ernest Hemingway said something like, "A soldier dies 2 deaths, once on the battlefield, and then once again when people stop saying his or her name." And you know, in this book, I talk about a little bit of intelligence and strategy and some of the battles and some of the routine, but at the heart, it's really about the seats that are left empty and the survivors who have to figure out how to fill those gaps. And you know, Joe gave me my life that night, and I hope Beyond the Outposts helps honor what he did with his life, his brief 41 years of it. So a little bit about me. When September 11th struck, I was a senior at Tulane University. I was in my last year of the military science Army ROTC program. So I was getting ready to become an officer. And I remember as watching the TV on 9/11, the planes hitting the World Trade Center and hitting their targets at the Pentagon. I knew in that moment that everything was changing for me. I thought I was going to be joining a peacetime army, but that was not to be the case. I did select armor as my branch and military intelligence as my basic branch, which means I get to do a little bit of both. I started in the armor, in my case, light cavalry. And I was assigned to the 10th Mountain Division, and I was there for 4 years and 9 months. And I spent 25 of those months in Afghanistan. I remember right after 9/11, a couple months later, after some of the special forces activity and the bombings, my military science instructor at Tulane, he asked me to come report to his office, and I did. And he says to me, "Stand at ease, Berkoff. I understand you're Jewish. You know you're probably going to be going to Afghanistan, right? You know what they would do if they found out you were Jewish?" This really caught me off guard. I said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, I really think you need to get some new ID tags. Mark them no preference, but don't let them know who you are." I thought this a little strange. I said, "Yes, sir," and I walked out of his office. I was kind of conflicted at this point with different emotions. So it was kind of, in a way, I was thankful. What if he's right? What if he knows more than I know? Or where is this coming from? Is it coming from some degree of ignorance, confusion? I wasn't know that was an early introduction for me into Afghanistan and being Jewish in Afghanistan. I served alongside 2 10th Mountain Division Medal of Honor recipients. In fact, up until this month, the only 2 from the 10th Mountain Division from the Afghanistan War. If you heard the news earlier this month, Sergeant Ollis posthumously received the Medal of Honor, and his family just received it at the White House on his behalf. I talk a little bit about, in the book, my service with those 2 gentlemen, one posthumous, Jared Monty, and I was involved in that fatal operation that took his life. I transitioned into military intelligence, went into the Washington, D.C. National Guard, and I used my intelligence experience to work in the intelligence community here, and I've been in the defense industry ever since. Today, I'm a president of the company called Rivertech, and we're located in Herndon, Virginia. I live in Northern Virginia now with my family, and they're here with me today in the front row. My wife, Rebecca, has been a source of patience and comfort for me in helping this book see publication. But really, quite literally, going back to sending some of the best care packages to forward operating base and array filled with fudge brownies that somehow managed to stay pretty soft. We were dating during my second tour, and I also have my kids with me today, Eliana and Aaron. And having my children here is a little bittersweet. I've shared some of these stories with audiences around the country, but today, you guys are going to hear, as you just did, about some of the names and some of the legacies of men that I served with who gave everything. As a father, you want to protect your children from the harder parts of the world. But as a soldier, I know that the only way to truly honor the fallen is by ensuring that we move their stories forward to the next generation. Also, my mother-in-law, Candy, is in the back. Thanks for being here. A little bit about my family legacy with the Jewish service members that inspired me. When I look back at what led me to join the Army, there was a trail that was blazed for me before I was born. My grandfather, David Goldberg, on the top left of the screen, was probably drafted into service, but he did so honorably and fought from France to Germany. And just a few days before VE Day, not far from Berlin, received a wound from a grenade, which put him in the hospital, and a wound that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He of course passed away about 15 years ago. There's also my great uncle, Larry Berkoff, the pilot. He was a daring B-24 pilot who, in 1944, he was steering the controls of his B-24, which was a failing aircraft. It was both engines had completely malfunctioned, and he had a crew of 8. He ordered everyone to bail out, and he kept the B-24 level enough, steady enough, so that they could all parachute safely out. But he himself never made it out of the aircraft. And he, in fact, steered the aircraft in the last few seconds away from the village of Lambourne in southern England, not far from the Channel, and probably saved the lives of a dozen or two civilians in Lambourne. And they've honored him with a plaque in town square today, and some other memorials. So these are some of the stories that I grew up with. But, these men were Jewish, but I don't think they were particularly religious. I suspect they probably did have a quiet faith about them while on active duty. The examples that they taught me about their service, it's not so much about their accolades, but I think a quiet resolve that they brought. And that's the legacy that I wanted to carry with me when I went to Afghanistan. I think, their parents were immigrants. They came here in the late 1800s, trying to escape the pogroms of Poland and Russia. So I think part of their inspiration for service was to make sure that this is a country that that their great grandkids could live in and enjoy freedoms that their grandparents didn't get. And here are those great grandkids today. Yeah. So I'm a amateur historian, and my book I talk about some of the heroes I served with, but really it's a book about confusion, about exhaustion, about trying to overcome different leadership challenges, and trying to make sense of a new war for our country while it's happening around you in real time. I've always been a very passionate consumer of soldier journals. I've got a whole library full of them at home, mostly from the American Civil War. And some of the graphics you see are some of my favorites, from Elijah Hunt Rhodes or Bull Rice or Daniel Chisholm. They just wrote about what happened to them, and it's a primary source. And I think those gritty, raw emotions really struck me. knowing that it wasn't written in hindsight, but literally, that day in 1863. So I think part of me wanted to contribute to that, what I think is a noble tradition. Excuse me. Okay. Beyond the Outpost is broken up into two halves. And really the two halves are the two deployments, my 9 months in Kandahar in that region of the southern part of Afghanistan, and then my 16 months with in the northeast along the Pakistani border. In the interest of time tonight, I'm only going to talk about the second tour in the northeast along the Pakistani border. So if you want to hear the whole story, this is part of the bookstore now. You can buy a copy here. But just to give you a little bit of some cultural familiarization to the area of operation I served in, some of the human terrain that we experienced. In the South, this is both the birthplace of the Taliban movement and the bank of the Taliban movement, right? So Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader of the Taliban, Kandahar, right outside of Kandahar, was his hometown. So we were driving right through his hometown in operations. And in this region, the Taliban weren't seen as invaders, post Cold War. They were the local sons returning home. So there was a lot of respect and confusion too from the locals that would ask us, why are we here? And and many of them would say, would believe or would assert that we were in Afghanistan not because of what happened on 9/11, but in reverse, that we invaded Afghanistan. We invaded Afghanistan, and as an outcome of that invasion, New York City was attacked. So we tried to reset the narrative for them. That was probably part of the Taliban propaganda. The South was also a narco state economy. This was the world's opium engine, and we would see it. As far as to the horizon, you could see the opium fields, the workers in those fields, protecting their multi-billion-dollar heroin trade, and that trade was funding this insurgency that we faced. In the Northeast, it was very different. This was a vertical battlefield. The Northeast region, that shaded area that you see, was our area of operation for my second tour. Very large area, about the size of the state of Virginia. There's 450 miles there of border country with Pakistan along the Pakistani tribal areas. So this was a global frontier, very rugged, multi-factional. The terrain was really as much of the enemy to us as guys with AK-47s. This was a vertical fight, and the enemy knew it. They used the terrain to their advantage everywhere we went. We felt like we were fighting an enemy that lived above us, that were hunting us. They were moving through these hidden goat paths that was not on any map that I had as the intel officer, making every valley that we moved through a potential kill box. It was also the who's who of militant groups. Whereas Taliban had stronger authority in the South, in the Northeast, we had all these splinter groups, the Haqqani Network, the Hizb Islami Gulbuddin, the Pakistani Taliban, TTP. So we didn't know who we were fighting most of the times. We would just call them ACM. It was an acronym we used called Anti-Coalition Militia. It was just simpler to call them that than try and figure out their loyalties. But maybe that was part of the reason why we were not successful in that counterinsurgency. Also in the Northeast, much heavier influence with Al Qaeda and the foreign fighters that would come through the Al Qaeda ranks. And of course, you could see the words Abbottabad on the far right side of the screen, just is where Osama bin Laden was held up for the last few years of his life before he was killed by SEAL Team 6. Osama bin Laden was operating in and around our area of operation while we were there in 2006 and 2007, which is really what drove a lot of the operations I write about. So in 2004, I was asked to help stand up a new reconnaissance squadron. The Army transformation was happening. I'm going to read for you a message that we received in Chapter 9 from the Army as we were told to stand up this new organization. So the Chief of Staff of the Army sent us this message in 2004. Our nation remains at war. Our adversaries threaten the ideals and the principles at the foundation of our society, the way of life those ideals enable, and the freedoms we enjoy. For the long term, the nation must be prepared to fight a protracted war of ideals against an irreconcilable and adaptive adversary. We need an army of campaign quality with joint and expeditionary capabilities. So what that meant for me was the unit that I would belong to during my first tour, deactivated, told we need to stand up a new reconnaissance squadron. Essentially, they need more light cavalry, more mobility, and the lethality and the weapon systems that we brought with us. So we stood up 371 Cav, also called Task Force Titan. And that's when I first met Joe Fenty. He was the commander. I was his first personnel officer, and a human resource officer. He asked me to help bring some order to the chaos of standing up this unit before I would officially transition over to intelligence. It was during this pre-deployment period, 2005, when I had a very unique Shabbat service. I was in central Louisiana in a training mission at Fort Polk, near Fort Polk. And one of the nice things about being in the Army is that if you want to demonstrate your faith on a Friday night or a Sunday morning, you just have to raise your hand. That's why the chaplain's there. They kind of have to comply with your requests as much as possible. So yeah, I'm in central Louisiana, and it was a Wednesday, and I remember writing a piece of paper and handing it to the chaplain and say, I would like to attend Shabbat services. I was smelly and tired and hungry, and I knew I was going to get about 6 hours of relief if I had signed up for Shabbat. So much to my surprise, Friday night comes, and the chaplain comes rolling up in a Humvee, and he said, "Where's Captain Berkoff?" And I raised my hand. He's like, "Come with me." I thought we were going to the chapel on post. Maybe they had a Jewish chaplain there. You know, a lot of times the Army would find laymen, kind of lay services leaders to lead a service, but he started taking me down some back roads, and I said, "Where are we going, sir?" He said, "Oh, I found a synagogue. It's about an hour from here. Sit back, take a nap." Like, okay. So we did some backcountry roads for a while in Louisiana. We come to a synagogue, and it's just me. We walk in, and there was a congregation of about 30 people there who had been notified I was coming, and they couldn't have been happier and more welcoming to have me. And so it was a couple hours of relief. I went right back to the woods later that night. But you know, that was a common experience for me. You know, if you wanted to, you know, express your religion, whatever religion that is, the Army would try to find a way. Around this time, I was corresponding with a unit in Afghanistan that was going through Operation Red Wings. I had mentioned the bloodiest day up until that time in the war. And at this time, I was starting to piece together that my first deployment, which was relatively calm, it was a dubious piece. The enemy watched us a lot during that first tour, hesitant to engage us directly. But I was starting to see an evolution at this point. And as the intel officer, I was watching the digital and the human footprints of an enemy that was really evolving quick. The Iraq War was now in its third year. So the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, procedures, most significantly the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, they were the Taliban was learning. They were trying to see what was working for the Al-Qaeda anti-coalition elements in Iraq. How can we export that here into this theater? Also, they were becoming much better organized. After a couple of years of training, of organizing in Pakistan, they were becoming more disciplined, better resourced, and they were patiently waiting, studying some of the carnage that they were seeing in Iraq. So when the world watched Operation Red Wings unfold, I was looking at some of the raw intelligence and certainly had come to the realization that this war is changing. We're going back into a very different environment than the country I had left. About 6 months later, we returned, and we first set up operations in Kaust province, right next to Fob Chapman, which made headline news a couple of years later as one of the worst attacks on CIA personnel in Afghanistan. We first deployed to Kaust, but we were told by the commander of our brigade commander that you're the Cav, you're reconnaissance, you're going to be the eyes and ears for our brigade. So don't get comfortable. Don't unpack all your bags. We're going to move you all over the battle space. I said this is about the size of Virginia, is this area of operation I was in. So while the Army was planning Operation Mountain Lion, where Colonel Fenty lost his life, I mentioned earlier, we were told we need to establish a footprint at Fob Nare, which is on the lower right-hand side of the screen. It's about a 300-mile movement to get to this part of northern Konar province, Fob Nare, where there was no conventional U.S. footprint. Yeah, there was a small Green Beret element there, about 12 special operators. And they told us they were very happy to have us. They had more targets than they had the ability to prosecute them. So they were happy to have more guns, more troops on the ground. When we arrived at Fob Nare, we almost immediately started taking incoming rocket fire. Mostly ineffective, but we got the hint. We weren't wanted there. And we learned, I had picked up through intelligence sources, that the cell responsible for dropping those rockets every day for about a week, they were all coming from a valley system nearby, the Kocha Valley, and they were led by a man named Daoud Ayoub. And I was starting to collect intelligence on him, and we were preparing for a mission to go find him. And I'm going to read to you now chapter 11. On 29 March, we conducted a very successful operation in the Kocha Valley, which is about 10 miles north of our firebase. A large convoy consisting mostly of our Charlie troop moved up to the mouth of the valley, dismounted, and faced west. Lieutenant Colonel Fenty and our Command Sergeant Major personally led this mounted and then dismounted movement through the rugged, graduated descent up the valley floor. During my mission planning, it only looked to be about a 4-kilometer movement to reach the village, but I continue to blunder in my estimation of the suck that's involved in navigating this terrain. Those 4 kilometers, wearing our 100 pounds of gear per man, were filled with punishing climbing switchbacks, which kicked our butts. What happened? Colonel Fenty conducted his village engagement. Maybe not surprisingly, no military-age males in this village, only old men. All the women were corralled and put into a building so we couldn't see them. So where were all the military-age males? Colonel Fenty had suspected something was up. He ordered everybody to leave the valley, but he asked for our sniper team to stay back in a hidden, concealed position and just watch and kind of protect our exfiltration from the valley. And that's when I remember getting a call from the sniper team leader. I was about 10 miles away at the operations center. And he said, "Hey, I've got eyes on 24 military-age males carrying weapons, radios, long antennas. They're popping out of the bush. They're watching our movement. What do I do?" I said, "It sounds like you have positive identifiable threat," which is part of our rules of engagement. So fire when ready, I told him. So the sniper identified who he thought looked like was in charge, and he took his shot, aimed well, and he killed the leader of this cell. We learned out later that it was the leader of this cell. Really, we just got very lucky. Uh, this was our first week in this part of the country, and I'll read to you kind of what some of the responses that we got back from the locals. Suddenly, our fire base was flooded with local elders who wanted to talk about peace. Peace through strength, they called it. And this was an essential part of the Afghan government's reconciliation program. This was Sergeant Hawes who took that shot. He gave me all of his information, sensitive site exploitation, including the rifle that he grabbed off the body of the cell leader. And he gave it to me and he asked me to process it through military customs, which I did. And I wrote in the journal, "It's a strange feeling to hold this weapon in my hands. I closely examined it. The previous owner had scratched carvings into the wooden stock, which I could not make out, but he festooned it with bright colored strings. This rifle could have been in his family for 20 years. It bore scars of rust and neglect, and was probably used to fight the Soviets as they passed through this part of Nuristan province. I did not march up the Kocha Valley. I did not take that shot. But holding the rifle in my hand and viewing the photographs of the site, it reminded me of why I wanted to pursue a career in military intelligence." John Krakauer, the author, has been a mentor of mine for about 15 years. I know he was kind enough to help me with the book, getting some of the words right, although it's pretty much written as it was back then. But it was nice to give me an endorsement. What's unique about John and how we met, right before Colonel Fenny was killed, he was shown a list of reporters that wanted to join us, embed with us. And Colonel Fenty was an avid mountaineer, an outdoorsman. He quickly recognized John Krakauer's name, and he said, "Yeah, we want John. He's going to inspire our guys to go above and beyond." Of course, he had recently climbed Mount Everest, wrote the book bestseller Into Thin Air. When John showed up at Fob Nare, it was right after the crash. Colonel Fenty was gone, but I was asked to sponsor him, so I made sure he was, that he got a bunk, and I said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to go out on every possible patrol that you'll send me on." And I thought, right, okay. But he stayed for almost 4 weeks. Most reporters will stay for about 2 days and get on the first bird out. But he did volunteer for some of the hardest climbing patrols. And he just slept right alongside the dirty, smelly soldiers. Didn't ask for any kind of special treatment. So we bonded over that. And he was there writing a book about Pat Tillman, who was recently killed at that time, about a year earlier, nearby where we were, and he wanted to understand where some of the sort of the terrain and the environment where Pat Tillman died. He did go on to write a book about Pat Tillman called Where Men Win Glory, which I helped him as an editor and consultant on. And we stay in touch, and we do Boulder, Colorado climbs every other year. Right before John left country, he met Jared Monty, who was one of our senior NCOs, who was the head of our forward observer element. So he was technically an artilleryman. He was in charge of our forward observers, our fisters, we would call them. And that will take me to this Battle of Hilltop 2610. So this is a battle that's now studied in the annals of the Army, including at the service academies. And it's a day that kind of weighs on me because I personally felt like I failed that day to provide the soldiers what they needed in terms of intelligence to survive. We're taught to be an intelligence officer, you're taught to come up with the most dangerous courses of action, MDCOA. And I couldn't possibly have dreamt up what the MDCOA actually played out to be here, which is why a series of accidents and mistakes led to so many deaths. We had our sights set on building another outpost in Kamdesh province, Afghanistan, made popular in the Jake Tapper book, The Outpost, also in the movie, The Outpost. It's about the Battle of Cop Keating, which happened in 2009. 3 years earlier, here I am, and I'm told we need to build an outpost in Kamdesh. To get there, though, there was only one road. And you can kind of make it out on the map, and it's this very narrow river gorge road that runs along the river gorge, and it's about 30 miles long. And you are sort of dominated by 360 degrees with canyons on both sides. It's a very precarious road. So in order to get to Kamdesh, we figured we need to understand the valley systems and the population centers along that road so we can try and secure it better. The first major valley system and village was Gowardesh in the top right box there near Hilltop 2610. So Gowardesh was the mission. And to get there, we sent Jared Monty and the same sniper team, about 15 men, up to the top of Hilltop 2610 to watch over Gowardesh before we would send in a main effort, an entire infantry company of about 100 men. So they were set there. They were told to set up an observation post, be concealed, don't get compromised. And I gave him some most dangerous courses of action, but they were not accurate in retrospect. I also said to Jared, make sure you bring an ICOM radio and a translator with you, because you're gonna need it. You're gonna need to understand what the locals are saying around you. Unfortunately, and I didn't know this until later, he could not find a interpreter that could do that climb to get up to Hilltop 2610 with him, or maybe they just refused to go. This operation got a little bit more complicated when on June 20th, one of our trucks hit an IED. This is our first IED. I mentioned IEDs earlier. Now we're starting to see it in our battle space. And it was right just north of Fab-Marais. Fortunately, the IED went off a couple seconds too early and only wounded the men, but it took out the front engine block of our truck. This really rattled us as a staff. We now had wounded. We now had an IED. It was coordinated with an ambush. So my commander said, we're not ready to get into Gowardesh tomorrow. We need another day. So we get on the net with Sergeant Monty, who's up there with his team. And I said, mission's delayed 24 hours. How are you guys doing? We're out of water, sir. They drank way too much water, more than we had planned for. It was late summer after all. Again, this comes back to logistical crises at hand here. So we needed to resupply them. Hilltop 2610, you can see the photograph. There's no landing a helicopter on that. So our logistics team came up with what we call a speedball. And it's almost like a duffel bag type object that's stuffed with food and water and ammunition, wrapped really tight and meant to withstand a 100-foot drop. So we thought this was the right idea at the time. Let's drop a speedball. We probably should have done it at night, but we did it in the late afternoon. And about an hour later, Sergeant Monty comes on the net and he says, we're taking heavy enemy fire. We're surrounded on all sides. I can't lift my head. If I do, I'll be shot down. One of his NCOs, Sergeant Patrick Liebert, was almost immediately killed with a gunshot wound to the head. And two junior members of his team, privates, were wounded pretty severely. They were taking cover behind a boulder. And Jared Monty made several attempts to go get them and bring them into a more secure area of their circle. On the third attempt, Sergeant Monty was cut down by an RPG. And he would later be, his father on his behalf would receive the Medal of Honor for Sergeant Monty. But that wasn't the end of the mission that night. Our teams fought back, and we had some help with the B-1 bombers. Someone had mentioned B-1s were active in this operation, and our own howitzers at Fab-Marais. And the enemy assault did peter out. One of the wounded men, his name was Private James, we were able to get him out on a rescue basket. So we alerted a medevac team out of Bagram Airfield. They did bring in sort of a rescue back on a cable that would drop, right? But there was no landing allowed. We were able to get James out, and I saw him come into the medevac center. I'm going to read to you part of chapter 13 on what happened next. I was standing in front of the aid station, hoping that Bradbury would be next to make it in there without any problems. But there was a delay, so I walked back to the top, and I heard over the net, the cable broke. Bradbury fell. The medic fell. I'm going to go get them. Out. That came from our sniper team leader, Sergeant Cunningham. Only God knows why, but somehow the cable snapped that was lifting out Bradbury and the medic attending him. And they both dropped 40 feet to the earth and died. So now we have 4 dead men on that damn hill. There's not going to be another risky nighttime extraction to pull anyone else out. Sergeant Cunningham and his guys did their best to find the bodies and cover them up and wait out the night. There's Sergeant Jared Monty. A lot of buildings, training centers, chow halls named after him today, especially at the home of the Field Artillery Center in Oklahoma. And there's Sergeant Cunningham and his sniper team on the lower left, or lower center. In 2009, I was invited to attend the White House Medal of Honor ceremony for Jared Monty, and that's me and his father, Paul Monty, in the lower right. I mentioned combat outpost Kamdesh. I'm going to read to you what life was like there. We finally set up the Kamdesh Provincial Reconstruction Team, which is what the command wanted us to do. They wanted to put State Department personnel there to connect to the local population. They weren't listening to us when we said the security apparatus in this area is not going to allow a provincial reconstruction. I wanted to put it up in the top of a hill, top of a mountain where we own the terrain. But all of the helicopters were in Iraq. This is 2006. So we were told you have to resupply yourself, and there's only one way to do it, and that's by the ground line. And we had serious resource needs. We needed people. We needed generators. We needed ammunition. We needed all sorts of different supplies to keep this sustained through a winter. That meant we were basically a slave to that road, that one way in, one way out road. In the fall of 2006, I spent about 6 weeks at Combat Outpost Kamdesh. And I was there as the intelligence officer forward. And I wrote a letter home to my family while I was there, which is part of chapter 15. I moved into Nuristan, into one of our new outposts, and it's about as rough living as you can get in the so-called modern army. We've had soldiers here for 3 months, but there's no running water still. There's no flush toilets. There's no hot food. Electricity is scarce and only to be used for our operations center. We occupied what was an old Afghan militia compound, and we live in their mud huts, and we fortified those huts with sandbags. But the sand brings the fleas, which we have to wear flea collars on our belts now. So unfortunately, it's a toss-up. Seek protection from the rockets and get the fleas. The road leading up to this base is littered with the shells of Soviet-era tanks that are now battlefield trophies to the local Nuristanis, who are very proud of their part in ousting the Russians from this part of Afghanistan. The security along this river road between Nuray and Kamdesh is worsened, I wrote later in the chapter. Just about every patrol that goes down this road is getting ambushed. There's only one way to get there, and it's a deep river valley floor. The roadside is littered with Soviet personnel carriers. We eat RPGs and heavy machine gun fire almost every time we travel down that damn road. Not only does the enemy own the high ground, but they have a very effective early warning system in place that alerts local cells of our fighters on both the north and the south side of the river to our presence, so they're consequently able to organize effective ambushes against us. So I was there for about 6 weeks, and I was fortunate to get helicoptered in for that, but I was told, no, you need to come back in the next ground resupply route, convoy coming back. So this was the end of October, and I remember the convoy was on its way, and we heard the shooting. We knew they were coming, right? Every convoy coming down that road's going to get shot at. They show up at the base, and a lot of the soldiers stepped out of the Humvees. They had never been there before, so they were not only in shock and shell shock from the ambush they just lived through, but the terrain around them, this fishbowl of a camp. And I went up to the patrol leader, and I said, "You have a LMTV in your convoy. Why is that? That's like an army school bus, big truck, way too big for that road. Could hardly get Humvees down that road." He said higher command wanted to see if an LMTV could fit down the road. Again, they're so focused on reconstruction, moving out way too fast than the security would allow. We all said, we don't need an LMTV here. It's going to take up way too much space. It needs to go back. And he said, well, that's a mission for another day. I said to him, when are you planning to go back? And he said, sir, if Jesus Christ himself ordered me, I am not going back down that road during the day. We're going to leave at 0200 tonight. And we own the night. And that was a night of low lunar illumination. So that was a good time to go. And he made the right call. I remember that night slowly meandering down that road through all of those plotted ambush points that I had been studying, but we rolled past through them all. Maybe the enemy was sleeping. Maybe they just didn't have the capability to fight us at night.
Question, looking at this map here. Are these towns, what are these towns like? I mean, are these 3-mud huts, or are these towns of some size, or I'm trying to get a sense.
They're very small. They're probably 30 to 50 structures. So that's the road that I took this photograph on the right from helicopter of the river road. And that's another one I took to see how precarious the road is. And we lost some Humvees, of course, along this road. Okay, 26 November, an awful tragedy. I'm going to read from chapter 16. Another one of my good friends in the Army is gone. They go now with almost a peculiar regularity and a sense of normalcy, and it makes my stomach knot up. First Lieutenant Ben Keating was a good friend, a fellow officer that I've come to respect since our first meeting 2 years ago. He started here as a Scout Platoon leader. Like me, he was supposed to go into intelligence. He came up through the squadron during its formative months, and he earned the respect of everyone around him. Very professional, intelligent, competent. He was the executive officer of Alpha Troop, the troop that was in charge of combat outpost Kamdesh. And he was the glue holding that company of men together. This was the same company that lost those men on the helicopter crash earlier in the spring. So that night, he was given the mission, this LMTV has to come back to Narang. And he would not give that mission to one of his soldiers. He said, I'm gonna be the one to drive that truck back. I'm not assigning a mission to one of my men that I wouldn't do myself. Now, officers aren't supposed to drive military vehicles on a combat operation. Everyone knows that. He knew that. Frankly, he probably wasn't trained to drive an LMTV either. Um, but he was a little hard-headed like that. And there's just inches. There's not a lot of flexibility in the size of this road. We also had some bad rainstorms come in earlier that week. So about 3 kilometers into the route, he did it at night, of course, also extremely difficult, but he would rather drive it at night than have his guys take fire. But that LMTV dropped about 200 feet into the river gorge when the wheels gave way. The photograph is an example of other rollovers that we had along the road that fall. Ben Keating was thrown from the vehicle. His pelvis was broken in multiple places. And we had to form a rappelling team to get him out of the river and up the mountainside and into an aid station. But he stopped breathing somewhere between the ropes and the aid station. And I remember being told what happened and that he was in the aid station, and we were allowed to say goodbye to him. Shortly after that, my commander asked me if I would be the summary court-martial officer for all of his personal effects and to get them home safely to his family. If you remember earlier in my brief, I said we were everywhere. We didn't have a home. We were constantly moving across the battle space. So his personal effects were in 5 different forward operating bases. So I spent the next month flying around to these locations and collecting his stuff, separating what was government issue, personal. And I wrote a letter to his family after I had shipped everything and it was heading to Aberdeen Proving Ground. I wanted to make sure that it was arriving safely and that they had a way to contact me. His father was a Methodist pastor of an unshakable faith, and he wrote me this letter in response. Captain Berkoff, December 2006. I want you to know how much we appreciate your kind words and the attention that you've paid to gathering up Ben's personal belongings. On more than one occasion in the last couple of years, I told Ben I would consider it an awful tragedy if he didn't survive this deployment. I was convinced that his unique blend of intelligence, his strength, his courage, it would make a more valuable contribution to society and his lofty ambitions. He wanted to become a congressman. He agreed, but he felt that military service was a necessary prerequisite for things to come. Ben was among the brightest and best who served in harm's way, and he had the potential to become America's next greatest generation. When he was home for R&R in October, he was lean, he was strong, he seemed larger than life. There have been so many tributes that have come in over the past few weeks from Ben's colleagues all over the world. And it's helped us understand that his life counted a great deal despite its brevity. Your message was written by a man whose parents must be proud. All right. Go a little bit faster here so we can wrap up on time. So this was supposed to be a 12-month deployment. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, to VE Day in Germany was 336 days. So 336 days between Utah Beach and Berlin. By middle of January 2007, I was on my 336th day. And to say that I was excited to finally meet my replacement and to go home would hardly capture my colossal enthusiasm. I'd spent hours with him. We went over the maps. I gave him everything he needed to be successful, including all of my DVDs, my books, my mattress, my pillows. I was getting out of there. And then I was woken up in the middle of the night And I'll read to you part of that on chapter 18. During the early morning hours of 25 January, well before sunrise, I was woken up and told to report to the commander's quarters. This was very unusual. As I walked over, I thought someone important was just killed or some big operation had changed the ball game. I remember walking into his room and seeing the somber faces of my fellow staff officers. The word had just gotten out. We're extended another 4 months. Maybe in June we'll go home. Secretary Gates was here. He was meeting with the brass, and a decision was made. We need more troops in country to accomplish our mission. So this was an extension period. And during this period, I was ordered to improve relationships with the Pakistani military that was just operating on the other side of the mountain range. That photograph in the lower right is with the Shatrali Scouts. I actually brought the pothole with me on the table here that they gave me. Pothole, their hat festooned with a mountain lion, which resonated with us as we were the mountain soldiers for the American Army. Okay, my Passover experience. I write about in the book that we held Passover in April of 2007. You can picture this. There's about 300 soldiers on the camp. And I reported up to the brigade chaplain that we had 5 of us, three officers and 2 enlisted that wanted to hold a Seder. Against most odds, the Army actually did helicopter in a Jewish chaplain, and he landed with crates of haggadahs and boxes of matzah and jars of gefilte fish, and I'm not kidding, teeny little grape juice boxes that you sip on. But we were proud of this little group. We hung this military guide on that he brought us, decorated with a Torah and a Star of David in front of our all-faith chapel. We wanted everyone to know, including the Afghans that worked on the base, exactly what we were doing. We felt secure enough. We did have our M4 rifles slung over our backs. It was the first time that we'd ever remember opening up a Seder, but being told to stack your arms, before you could sit down. But the symbolism wasn't lost on us. The Passover is a story of the Jewish people's liberation from Egypt. And 1,000 years later, there we were, different desert, but still carrying that same story of liberty. A whole year had passed since the crash, and I was asked to say a few remarks at the dedication of Jalalabad Airfield to be renamed Fob Fenty. I was asked to say a few words, and I'll just read a couple lines from that speech. I remember the events of May 5, 2006 really well. I was right here at Jalalabad conducting liaison with the brigade. Colonel Fenty had flown in that morning. He just had a few hours of sleep, but he was the first one into the office on the morning of May 5th. He'd been humping the mountains with his soldiers for the better part of that month, but he rushed back to do final coordination before commanding the extraction of our men. When I saw him that morning, he looked really tired, more tired than I've ever seen him before. His hair was long. His uniform had that familiar tarnish and stench. And one would think he was bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders. But despite all going on in his mind, he said to me that morning, "Hey, Ross, did you ever get a chance to see that Jewish chaplain that I had sent here for Passover?" With everything going on, he always cared about his soldiers' interests first. And I say in the speech that, there's no monument monumental enough to bear his name. But I had no idea that about 4 years later, to the very day, 4 years later, that Fob Fenty would be used as the staging area for SEAL Team 6 to launch their operation into Abbottabad to find and kill Osama bin Laden. And after he was killed, bin Laden's body was reportedly kept in a CIA compound at Fob Fenty before it was eventually dumped into the Indian Ocean. So thinking back, it's kind of ironic, but I think Joe Fenty would have been proud to have his name memorialized on that base to support a U.S. operation that killed the leader and planner of 9/11. He was a New Yorker after all. I'm going to skip over the ambush, which you can read about, and kind of wrap up. This book came about for me through a couple of tragedies in my own life. One was personal for me, and one was international. In 2020, I lost my stepdad to a very aggressive cancer that he first contracted in September of 2001 when he was helping clean up southern Manhattan, inhaling that toxic dust. He was part of the New York, New Jersey Port Authority. A few months after I lost him, the security situation in Afghanistan was tumbling out of control. It was becoming chaotic. Afghan babies were being thrown over barbed wire to get them out of the country. Watching all of that unfold on the news, it felt like watching part of my own life unraveling. And many of the veterans that I served with, it definitely reopened some old war wounds and made us question, what was it all for? All those battles, all that money, all that resource. What did it mean? And some of the veterans I talked to, they were hurting emotionally. They were even hurting themselves. And on my memoriam page, I list 14 soldiers I served with that are no longer with us, and some of them are from suicide. So, that broke me in a way because I understood some of their disillusionment and the sense of betrayal. And that's when I started taking my old notebooks out that I had kept and rereading them, and I started piecing them together to transcribe into this book. I think my story is just one of tens of thousands of soldier stories, but I'm hoping that the war is not going to be defined by how it ended tragically, but instead by what we, the service members, did for the American people during that war. I mean, we prevented another 9/11 for 20 years. We protected thousands of Afghan civilians, children, provided food, medical assistance, roads, schools, and we forged these friendships with our Afghan military counterparts in some of the hardest places that you can do so on Earth. So, I think the war, from the politics lens, it's always going to change, but the courage and the loyalty and the humility and the humanity of our service members there, that I hope will never lose its meaning. And that should be our legacy. And no one can take that from us. I spent a lot of years carrying the weight of that dark corner on the compound after Colonel Fenty's death, that terrible May night. Eventually, I went back to see Colonel Fenty, my boss, my commander, at his final resting place in Section 60, grave A342. And I wanted to bring my daughter with me, Eliana, who's here with me today. Standing with Eliana there, I realized, Joe never got to meet or hold his little girl, Lauren. He sacrificed so that I could hold mine. Lauren Fenty is a remarkable young woman today. She's a sophomore at the University of Virginia. I stay in touch with her and her mother. Seeing the life that Joe left behind and the life that he allowed me to live, it did bring me some sense of closure. We don't just carry the grief of our fallen. We carry their legacy, or at least we try to. And as long as we remember them, they're never truly gone. It's kind of going back to that Hemingway quote. And that's, the real reason why I wanted to publish Beyond the Outpost, to make sure that men like Joe Fenty aren't forgotten. Sorry for going a little long, but I really appreciate you listening to me today and coming to this event and online. The museum was nice enough to purchase copies for their bookstore. So I hope you'll pick one up and correspond with me and let me know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And it's a great tribute, and we're doing what we can to help remember those who sacrificed of themselves for others. So I think we can get to Q&A now. We'll start with an online question. If you have a question here in the room, please raise your hand and we will get you the microphone for that. But I'll start with one from online from Lee Kitchen, who writes, as a very old cavalry officer, I am exceedingly proud of you. I purchased your book this morning. How are you inserted? Depending on the enemy TTPs, did you perform and counter recon missions? Did you operate with Apache gunships? And he signed it, Lieutenant Colonel retired Lee F. Kitchen, Brave Rifles.
Brave Rifles. I think I got most of that. Definitely Apache gunships were integral. Post-air support was a very powerful capability, especially when fighting in this vertical battlefield that I spoke of. We were constantly integrating, whether it be an Apache gunship or we had JTACs on the ground with us. Those are Air Force technicians that would help us do the coordination. I don't know how to call a B-1 bomber, and the other guys in my squad don't know how to do it either. But a JTAC is an Air Force tech that is an expert on that kind of air-to-ground coordination, and really powerful to have.
A couple questions here about the poppy and heroin economy. Did it have a direct impact on your operations, or was it just something you were observing while you were there?
It was, when I was rolling through those opium fields, we felt like we were not welcome, but we were not directly engaged in conflict. Again, this was early in the war, so 2003, 2004. The enemy, I think, was still reeling a bit from post 9/11. So we felt some unfriendly eyes. We didn't get as many hand waves as we drove by, and we certainly weren't wanted. And I think if we had conducted those same missions 2 or 3 years later, many of us probably would not have come back unscathed, because this was some of the worst battlefields of the war. The British in particular lost had a lot of casualties in Helmand province a couple of years later. No, I wouldn't say we were directly impacted. There was once in a while we would have a soldier that would get a little bit too adventurous and get into those opium fields and think it would be funny to bring some back to base. But that was few and far between. There was a question in the back in the blue.
Thank you for the talk, and especially thank you for writing the book. I have not read it yet. I plan on buying a copy. My brother was killed by an IED in Iraq, so I didn't get to hear his stories personally. So
I'm so sorry.
I genuinely appreciate your I'm sorry, doing this over your head. Your telling stories, and especially remembering the people that you served with.
What was your brother's name?
His name was First Lieutenant Charles L. Wilkins. He was killed outside of Balad, Iraq. And that is my question. Again, the people that he served with have been amazing at remembering him. And every year, his birthday, his death day, every year making sure that his name is said. So I greatly appreciate you doing the same for the people that you served with. My question is, now in retrospect, now that we are so many years on, when you mentioned that in 2006, there were so many people and so many supplies and resources in Iraq that you were short in Afghanistan. Do you, while looking back, kind of wish that they had, especially since we did ultimately find Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, the planners work in Afghanistan, do you the people that you served with kind of wish that they pushed those resources?
Yes,
where you were?
Absolutely. Yeah, we felt like we were forgotten about in those years. I mean, I think in the latter half of the 20-year war, in 2009, we experienced the surge in Afghanistan. So we had over 100,000 troops in country in 2009. compare that to when I was there 6 years earlier, where we had 8,000, which was not enough to do what we knew we needed to do. And if you read my first tour, you get a sense of the confusion that was rampant. We didn't know what we were really supposed to do there. We knew that there was a valuable mission to be had, but we didn't feel like we had great guidance from the senior echelons of command. It was a forgotten war. In fact, one small kind of microcosm of the forgotten war piece, when I came home for R&R, my own R&R in 2006, I would see friends or family, and they would say, where were you? Where'd you come from? And I said, I was in Afghanistan. I'm home on R&R. Oh, you're in Afghanistan. Thank goodness. I thought you were going to say you were in Iraq. Like I was on some kind of vacation. Like I didn't have it all that bad, you know? Couldn't have been further from the case.
I'm listening to you, and I guess my question is, in the big picture, what were we trying to do in this area of Afghanistan? And the reason why I ask that, and it may sound like a silly question, but this is an enormous area. I mean, the purpose of ground forces is to seize terrain and people. And this is such a big area. You could probably put the entire United States Army there, and you really probably couldn't control this place. It's a bunch of rocks in the middle of nowhere. Why were we doing what we were doing? I mean, I could see blasting it with bombs and having ISR assets and what have you, and blasting things with bombs, but why were we actually trying to set up outposts in a place where every tactical advantage, if you will, trying to run Humvees up and down these little tracks, it was essentially the enemy applying their advantages against our weaknesses for a prize that arguably wasn't worth winning. What were we trying to do?
So as a tactical leader there, I was trying to separate the enemy from the population. So how do you do that? You have to be present. And it was really twofold. We were trying to connect the people to the fledgling government of the democratic government of Afghanistan that we were building up. So we were trying to connect the people to those government institutions, including the district centers in Kamdesh, Afghanistan. It starts at the lowest level. The district center needs a district leader that needs to be tightly connected politics to the provincial leadership, which is tightly connected to Kabul. So in one way, we're trying to build the apparatus for this government to take hold. But also, as the intelligence officer, I saw the Osama bin Laden reports. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere, he's all around us. Or one of his deputies, right? Just as important. So in order to create a access corridor for intelligence community agencies, for the FBI, for Joint Special Operations Command to find and kill Al-Qaeda senior leadership, they needed conventional forces to open up those corridors. Go to Kamdesh, go to Naray, put in outposts, secure the corridors so that we can drop our collectors in those locations. I mean, I saw the intelligence community footprint dramatically increase from the beginning to the end of my tour. All right. So I knew, I don't think the everyday grunt knew that, but I knew that was one of the reasons why we're there.
Was, given that a remote valley out in northwestern Afghanistan, I mean, this sort of, in the middle of nowhere, was there any possible way of establishing a connection between the central government in Kabul and this remote valley? I would think that Kabul might as well have been in another solar system as far as these people were concerned. Was this a realistic aspiration?
Of course, the answer is no, it's not. And that's one of the things that we never learned in that 20-year war, the counterinsurgency campaign. It was fought in 20 iterative 1-year engagements, fought by a command that would be there for a year and then they would leave. There wouldn't be a good handoff. There wouldn't be an adequate lesson learned or brought over to the next element to share. So And I think if that transition had been effective, we would have learned much earlier in the 20 years that there's no counterinsurgency campaign that's going to work in this region. It's too remote, it's too backward, and just the cultural and the tribal dynamics are just nothing that we can comprehend in U.S. coin doctrine. I did my best on that one. That's a tough.
No, I just listen to you and it's fascinating, and I'm just like, this just can't be. Was this something that, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of hogging things here, but this is so fascinating to me. Is this something that what you told me and the conclusion, is that something that you only sort of think about in hindsight, or if Captain Berkoff had been had a one-on-one with Secretary Gates or the CENTCOM commander at the time, is this what you would have told him?
No, I think I was drinking the Kool-Aid back then. That, no, I mean, I pushed back, and I got my butt chewed for it. For example, there was a senior spiritual leader in Kamdesh that U.S. government, Afghan government wanted to flip sides because we knew that he was anti-U.S. propaganda, right? So, and I would write in my reports that he's working against us. And the feedback I got would be, you can't write that. Don't say that. We need to make security progress. And I would fight I'm the analyst here, and I've got to stand by this report. And I'm saying that this guy is working both sides. And I'm sure I'm one of scores and scores of intelligence officers that was in that particular situation.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question.
You mentioned that a number of your colleagues felt betrayed. And I was hoping you might elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, in the last probably 5 years of the war in Afghanistan, we were not conducting unilateral offensive operations against Taliban targets anymore. We were only there in an advise and assist capacity. And that's because that's what the politics and the American people wanted. They didn't want more casualties. So we minimized our stance to an advise and assist role, despite what the security concerns were showing and the increased strength and unity of Taliban and their insurgency across the country. So they were growing stronger, but we're going to change our role. And maybe that's the right call. Like we're talking about, could we win? Do we just bomb everything for the next 5 years? Is that the right decision? Absolutely not. So I think when I say we felt betrayed, in part, it's the timeline that was set by the administration at the time, multiple administrations. It was not based on reality or metrics or performance. It was based on a time that we're going to leave country on this date, and we broadcasted that. And the Taliban took advantage of that broadcast. And when we started, this is when I first saw that things were not going to go right. When we started taking out our air assets, the Afghan air aviation elements were rudimentary, and they needed us, especially our fuel. And when we started pulling out our fuel and we started pulling out our aviation assets and saying, it's on you guys now, I saw the dominoes about to fall. The way that the chaotic kind of withdrawal, it shouldn't have happened that way. There could have been a better way to do it. And I don't have time to go into it in this setting, but yeah.
Also mentioned that when you said report stop, I said don't write back.
Yeah.
That's so. that doesn't sound viable. And I'm wondering, how common has that been?
It's common, and it's still common today.
It's been collaborated on today, or?
I mean, I went to the Pentagon and worked for the intelligence community after I left the Army. And I saw, and I worked the Afghan account in the basement of the Pentagon. And I saw the same pushback when I would present a security posture of a particular province in Afghanistan. And I would be told, you need to rosy this up. It's not really that bad. Thanks.